Amen. So again, welcome everybody. We are diving back into our series. It's a 4-week series through the book of Habakkuk where we have entitled it, When God Doesn't Make Sense. We're in week 2 now, and just to kind of catch us all up to speed on what we sort of covered so far, a little information about this little, maybe often unread book in the Old Testament. Here's a little background information. So Habakkuk is a minor prophet, and again, that doesn't mean that he's any less important just because minor comes before prophet. It's just because it's a smaller book. It's 3 chapters in length as compared to like Isaiah, that's like 66, and so it's much smaller. So he's a minor prophet, and he is actually going to be serving and speaking for God in the southern kingdom of Judah in the final years before it's going to be wiped out, taken over by the Babylonian Empire. And so he is speaking not necessarily to the people, because this is what makes this book interesting. Most of the prophets would speak a word from God to the people. In this book, we're actually getting an inside look at the inner dialogue between Habakkuk and God. So it's kind of like his prayer journal of sorts, where we're getting an inside scoop on his conversation, his dialogue between him and God. It's really special. And so what is happening is Babylon is going to be taking over this kingdom of Judah, and essentially God is going to use them as his instrument of justice. And so he's going to bring justice to the unfaithful Israel who has been living in this way. And what's really special about this book is because we're getting to see Habakkuk's struggle. We're getting to see his questions and his concerns. It almost humanizes the prophets in a way that most of the other books don't. And so we're really getting to see that, like, this prophet Habakkuk, who was a man of God, speaking on God's behalf, is simply human. He has questions, he has doubts, he has concerns, and he brings them to his God who cares. And so he goes to him in this way. And what we also said was Habakkuk's name actually means to embrace or to wrestle. That's the Hebrew there is Habakkuk. It means to embrace or to wrestle. And it's really symbolic. It's really beautiful because Habakkuk is going to eventually embrace God and follow him in faith in this way, trust God. But first he has to wrestle with this idea that this world is so broken and yet God, you're so good. And so he's trying to reconcile all of this. And so we're going to see in this series, in this book, this progression of sorts of Habakkuk saying, I'm moving from confusion to consolation. I'm going to be in this perplexed state of this world is where he begins, but then he moves to peace in God. So perplexity to peace. And so having kind of explained some of that, let's dive into a little bit of the word. So Habakkuk is having this hard time believing that God is so good, yet so much bad is happening. So last week we covered he asked God, why God? How God? Like he has questions just like you and I do. Maybe you have asked questions like this. God, how could you allow blank? How could you allow this? God, why don't you fix this? Where are you at, God? Why is it that you're doing this? Or maybe, why is it that you're not doing this? Which is Habakkuk's question at this time. He's looking and he's surveying the people and he's saying, I'm seeing that our people are living unjustly. I'm seeing that our people are living with all these idols in their life. They're not pursuing you, God, and yet you just don't seem to do anything. Like nothing's happening here. If you're so good, then why is all this happening? That's his first question. And we ended things last week on verse 5, because as he has spewed out his questions and his concerns to God in the first 4 verses of chapter 1, we get to God's beginning of his answer in verse 5. And this is what the verse said. It says, look at the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. And I love those verses there. I love that verse because God is essentially answering Habakkuk. Habakkuk is like, God, why aren't you doing anything here? And God is like, oh, well, I am doing something, but it's going to be something that's hard to chew on. You're not going to comprehend it. And here's why. He continues in verse 6. I am raising up the Babylonians. Some of your translations in your Bibles may read Chaldeans. It's the same people. It's just 2 different names. So I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth and seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. This is God's explanation of who these are, his description of the Babylonians. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves to promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than the wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like the sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities by building earthen ramps to capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God. And we will stop there. I mean, this is quite a word, right? So Habakkuk is just trying to say, God, it doesn't make any sense. You don't seem to be doing anything. And God says, oh, but I am. And here's what I'm doing. Essentially, God's saying, I'm raising up the Babylonians, these awful people. I mean, they use a pretty much scorched earth policy here, right? They just come through and they demolish everything, take anything and everything they can. And God describes them in this way. He's saying they are a bad people. They come swifter than leopards. They come and destroy everything. And then he ends there in verse 11 by saying that they act like it's their God gave them the strength to conquer all these things. And so they take this pride in themselves, right? This is what we're doing. When in fact, God is explaining this. The only reason that they're going to come and do this is because I'm going to use them as my agents of justice to correct the people that I love. You've been living in an unfaithful way, Judah, and so here is the justice for your unfaithful living. And so God is responding here. You've been living in awful ways, but I am a God who is of his word. I'm not just going to let this go by. I'm actually going to do something here. And the Babylonians, they're going to come through, and then essentially the outcome is that they're going to cry out to God for help. That's the result here. Now, that's quite an answer. I mean, as you and I are reading this, and if we heard this word right, that's like, what? That is a big response here. I mean, Habakkuk is just saying, hey, God, I see all this horrible stuff. I just got done telling you, look at all the awful things, all the awful people in this wild world. And I just said, how are you so absent? And God, respond. You respond with, I am doing something. I'm actually going to use these awfuler people to come through and right things. And Habakkuk is struggling with this. Let me tell you, he doesn't like this answer. He doesn't enjoy this response from God because we actually get question number 2 from Habakkuk, right? So he raises a second question here. He's like, whoa. Okay, wait, God, wait just a second. I just got done telling you, I've been tormented by all of this evil, all of this bad around me, and now you're going to tell me you're going to use the Babylonians? The Babylonians to come and correct things? We are way more righteous than them. Habakkuk is responding in this way. He knew that Judah was a jacked up people, that they struggled, they had their issues, and they had things that they needed to work on, but at least they followed God. Like the Babylonians, they are these pagan people. He's like, God, they don't even worship you, and you're going to use them? This doesn't make sense. We, at least the Jews, worship you sometimes. We haven't been doing that great recently. And so he's using this compare and contrast thing here, which, if I might add, you and I do. We often compare, right? And comparatively speaking, Babylon is a much worse people. Judah, the people of God, they are at another level of righteousness. They still fall, they're still broken, but the Babylonians are much worse, right? That's what he's trying to do here. But the danger is we should not compare. We shouldn't compare. Because the truth is we're all miserably broken, sinful people, right? Isaiah 64:6 tells us that even our best deeds are like filthy rags. Romans 3:23, we're all sinners. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. It's dangerous to compare. And so Habakkuk, he's just struggling here. He's trying to pull at any strand he can get. And he's like, how could you use them? It doesn't make sense. How could you use these people? And then he continues. He raises these issues to God. We're in chapter 1, verse 12. he says this, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Habakkuk says, I know that our people need correcting. I know that we have issues, we have wrong things that we've done, we need discipline. And I believe that you're not going to let us die from this. But then verse 13, your eyes are too pure to look on evil, God. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why? Why then do you tolerate the treacherous, the Babylonians? Why are you silent while the wicked Babylonians swallow up those who are righteous themselves, us the Jews? He's like, why is it that you're doing this, God? He's still comparing here. And the question that he has for God is, why would you do this? That's the second question. And you and I have been there. You and I have felt this, right? We have questions. And I just want to pause here again, like I did in the first message, and just say, it's okay to have questions. Habakkuk is on a journey, right? He's walking here, and like many of us on this journey, as we're talking about these three stages, as we're journeying through the book of Habakkuk, we're going to see him go through three different stages. The questioning stage, which he's still in. And then God's going to call him in chapter 2 into this trusting stage. And then in chapter 3, we're going to get to Habakkuk's rejoicing stage with his prayer of exaltation. And so he's in the questioning stage still, though, like you might be. I'm not sure where you're at this morning. Wherever you're watching this online, you might be questioning some things. And you might be saying, God, I don't get it. Why, God? And it's okay to question when God doesn't make sense. It's not wrong to ask them. The Bible has lots of examples of people who asked questions of God. Take, for instance, Moses. So Moses is there. He's fled into Midian at this point because he had killed an Egyptian. And God is going to call him to go back to Egypt and speak to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. It's been 400 years of slavery. It's time for them to be free. Now, Moses is a very reluctant guy, right? We know this about him. He's like, well, God, I stutter. I'm not really sure about this. And God's like, that's okay. Your brother Aaron, he's going to go with you. He's going to go and do this whole thing with you, so you have no excuse. So Moses is going to go and do this. This is the Kody version of the burning bush experience in Exodus 3. And so he hears this word from God and he follows through, right? He goes to Pharaoh and he's like, hey, Pharaoh, you got to let God's people go. And Pharaoh essentially laughs. He's like, That's funny. That's funny. Because, you grown up in the palace, Moses. You grew up in luxury, right? And then you go and you kill an Egyptian and you flee. And you've been gone for a while. And you think you can just waltz right in here to the palace and talk to me, Pharaoh, and just say, hey, all your free slave labor, you got to let them go. That's funny. That's really funny. And yeah, so he essentially says no way to Yahweh. He's like, no, I'm not going to do it. This is not going to happen. And so Moses is struggling here, right? He has some questions. He ends up leaving the presence, and what happens, the word says, the Bible says, is that Pharaoh actually makes it harder on the people of God, makes their work more strenuous, the text will say. And so I can imagine like he's going out of the palace and like the Jewish foreman comes up to him and he's like, seriously guys, like talking to Moses and Aaron, you knuckleheads, like really? You went in here and you made life harder for us. You clearly didn't read, the art of the Egyptian deal here. And now we're all struggling because of your mess up. And so Moses has some questions. Exodus 5:22 says this. Moses returned to the Lord and he said, why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this not why you have sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people. You have not even rescued your people at all. He's got questions for God, right? And he comes to God with his burden. He's like, you sent me here to do this, and it's only gotten worse. Where are you at, God? What are you doing? And God didn't bite his head off. He was okay with that. He's a big God. He can deal with the questions. Look at the prophet Jeremiah. I love this word. Jeremiah 12:1. He says, righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you. Yet let me talk to you about your justice. That's how that verse continues. Let me talk to you about your justice. I've got a little confusion with the way that you practice your judgment, God, or lack thereof, right? I've got some questions for you, he says. And the next part of verse 1 there, he says, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do they prosper? Why are the happy the ones who deal so treacherously? We struggle. Why is it that these wicked people are prospering and yet I'm floundering here? He has questions, right? And God doesn't bite his head off. You can look all over the Psalms and see that God is often questioned. Psalm 10, verse 1, why do you stand far off, O Lord? Why do you hide your face in times of trouble? Psalm 42, 9, I will say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go on mourning because of the oppression of this enemy? Psalm 44, 24, why do you hide your face and forget my affliction and my oppression? These questions over and over and over again. There's so many examples throughout the scripture that people have questions when God doesn't make sense. And it's okay, brother or sister, watching online or here in this room, if you've got questions, if you've got concerns, God can take those questions. He's a big God. However, if I can follow that up with this, he's not obligated to answer your questions. He's not. At least not how you think, how I think, and the timing that we wish it would happen, right? In fact, in this instance, in Habakkuk, God doesn't really even respond to this question. As we will continue next week and look in chapter 2, God is actually not going to answer this question at all, but God is going to tell Habakkuk how to live when it doesn't make sense. And so he's not going to answer his question, but he's going to say, this is how you go forward in it, though. And so we're going to pick that up next week, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, Habakkuk moves on from how in the world can you use these Babylonians to how long is this going to happen, right? He's wanting his timeline taken care of, which I think you and I do at times as well. When things don't make sense, Habakkuk and you and me will ask, okay, if I'm having to walk through this valley, how much longer do I got till I get to the mountaintop, right? Like, how much longer do I have to go? And I think when we ask that, we really have two tendencies at times. We're either asking and we don't expect an answer at all, or we're demanding that God answer us and on our time, on our own time, right? When it makes sense and it's preferable for me, right? We have two tendencies. We either say, God, how long is this going to last? And we don't expect an answer at all. Or we're like, God, I need you to fix this. And now, like, I need it now on my timeline. We ask those things. And truthfully, neither of those are good options. And what's beautiful is that Habakkuk really doesn't choose either of those options in our text here. As you read it, you might read it that way, but what we see is a third option, a correct attitude. Habakkuk is willing to wait, and he's even willing to be corrected. He's willing to wait and willing to be corrected. He ends this section of his dialogue in chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. I'm not going to have them on the screen or read them, but he compares Babylon to this evil fisherman that is like casting its net and catching all the righteous fish, and they're devouring them and tearing them apart. And so this is how he describes them. And then in chapter 2, in verse 1, he ends his dialogue. And he says this, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. That's the New King James Version. I love that version because of that last phrase, when I am corrected. And I think that this gives the most clear translation of this text from the Hebrew. He is not saying all of this and saying, God, you need to change. He's actually in a right mindset at this time. The lesson that we learn here from Habakkuk is that he's positioning himself to hear God's voice. He's positioning himself to hear God's voice, to even be corrected. So he's waiting and he's listening and he's ready to receive the correction that he needs. Because the truth is, if we fail to position ourselves to hear God's voice, then we run the risk of just missing God's answer altogether. If we're not prepared to hear him, if we're not going to his word, if we're not reaching out to him, you're not going to hear from him. Because you're not positioning yourself to hear him. And so we have to position ourselves to hear his voice so that we don't run the risk of missing it when he actually speaks. we have to be prepared for this, right? He's willing to hear our cries. He's really willing to hear our questions. The desire of his heart is that he be in relationship with you, and so he's listening. He wants to know what's on your heart. But yet then we respond with like, I don't want to desire him. Like, I don't desire him. I'm not going to go to his word. I'm not going to pray. Like, that's a reciprocal relationship here. He's listening. He's pouring in. He's leaning in to you and to me and wanting to hear our questions, our doubts, our concerns, and he wants us to lean in too. And so he's calling us to this relationship. We have to, like Habakkuk, come to a place where we can listen to God. And he was there. He wasn't thinking God's in the wrong and he needs to explain himself, but rather he knew something that I think we often forget. That if God doesn't make sense and his ways are above our ways and we can't comprehend them, that it's not God who has made a mistake. It's not God who needs to correct himself, but rather it's his own perspective that needs correcting. It's your perspective and my perspective that needs the correcting and adjusting. And we ask God for that and we listen and we're ready to be corrected like Habakkuk was. The idea is this, that if God permits it in your life, then there's a purpose for it in your life. I think that that's a good word. I heard a pastor share that once. If God permits something to happen in your life, out of his sovereignty, he allows it to happen. However hard or difficult it is, there's a purpose for it. And so when we ask God, what's the purpose here? What am I needing to learn here? How can I grow from this here? God, correct my mentality, because everything I'm seeing is that this is not what I want. It's not on my time. God, take it. And Habakkuk's like, no, that's my inclination, right? But I'm going to end all of this. My last word here is that I'm going to stand here and I'm ready to be corrected. I'm listening for you. I'm positioning myself to hear you, God, speak to me and help change my heart, right? It's a good word that we learn. We have to come to the point in our questioning where we have like one of two options here, right? When we're in the questioning stage, we have to come to the point where we either continue to torture ourselves with all the why God this, why God that, how could you this? We got to come to the point where either we keep torturing ourselves with all of those questions or we can trust God. We can either keep torturing ourselves with all the questions or we can trust God, believe that he is fundamentally good, and we trust him that he is going to be in control even when it doesn't make sense. It's kind of like this idea. I thought of this as we're closing. Thinking of the idea that either we can think on all the questions, we can keep asking the questions, or we can just trust. It's like this. Most of us want that with our kids, right? I was thinking about this as I was talking with Charlotte, and it's been really hard recently. She's very opinionated and very wanting to go her own way at the age of 2, and I love it. It's hard, and so she's wanting to do her own thing, right? And kids, they just lack the understanding. They lack the capacity to really understand the wisdom that parents bring to the picture. Right, so Charlotte really loves to run around in the yard and play, and sometimes she gets way too close to 20, and I'm like, the really busy road in front of our house, if you haven't been here. So there's this really busy highway right in front, and I'm like, Charlotte, you can't run towards the road, but she likes to sprint and jet towards it, and she's like, I gotta go, and she's taking off, and I'm like, baby, you can't run towards 20. You can't run towards 20. It's very dangerous. Do not do that. And she's like, well, Dad, like I'm just chasing butterflies. Like you're a buzzkill, Dad. Like you're stealing all my joy. She's wanting to like run after these butterflies. I'm like, all right, butterflies, you want to see some butterflies? Like come to Dad's car and look here on the grill. There's some butterflies there, right? You know what? They're dead. Because that's what happens when you run into 20. So don't run into the road, right? And you can't get it through their skull. I'm just stealing all the fun, right? Whether they're 2 or whether they're 15, kids, they just lack the capacity to really understand every bit of wisdom that a parent can bring to the picture, right? We do this out of their good. We care for them because we love them. And it's the same way with God. It is. It's the same way with God. There are simply some things that we are never going to understand. We are going to lack the capacity to understand how a good God is allowing this hard thing to happen. God, how is it that you have a plan? How did you permit this? And you're saying there's a purpose. I don't get it. And at the same time, as our kids, we're wanting them to say, hey, I just trust you, Mom. I just trust you, Dad. God is asking the same thing here. It really is. That there will be times when it just doesn't make sense. I don't like that you're doing this, God. I don't understand it. And he wants us to come to the point of stop torturing ourselves with all the questions, all the why, I don't get it, and start to trust him. Start to trust him. That God is good. That he has a work in progress in your life, that he is going to bring it to completion, and that we just trust him and take that next step. That's where we're going to pick up next week with Habakkuk. He's going to move from the questioning stage into the trusting stage. And I just want to offer that to you and I today to say, brother or sister, let's move into the trusting stage and trust our good Father who has the best of intentions for us and is wanting good for our life. And he's asking us to just trust him. So would you do that today?